Good afternoon.
Oh, wait, just 1 second.
Oh,
So, is everybody set? Okay, Jonathan, go ahead.
okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Hill. I wanted to start off by explaining the reason that I'm not clean shaven this morning. So, as I was getting up this morning, I had the decision of shaving or not shaving. I had a lot of work that needed to be done. And what I decided would be a good idea would be, I could actually probably just find a verse in the Bible to justify not shaving for you this morning. And sure enough, I did. I found a verse that says, come to me as you are. It's a paraphrase of Matthew 11:28, where he's talking about the weary, the sick, the hungry. And essentially, what that means is you don't need a shave. You can come as you are, right? Now, but the problem with such a application of a biblical passage is pretty obvious. For example, if you're naked, you probably should put some clothes on. You can't just come to somebody completely naked. There's social norms and other things that you have to abide by. So what I wanted to do was actually just to use this idea that I had to demonstrate what I think is one of the most common ways that people apply biblical passages. They have something that they want to justify, and they look for it. So I'm not standing here as an example of what we should do. I'm standing here as an example of what we usually do. And that's, I think, a completely normal thing to do as a human. So the topic of my sermon, though, however, is to expand upon a sermon that I found from Saperstein that was given in 1933, titled, Are We Civilized? And what I want to do is I want to take this sermon, what he was talking about at that time was lynchings in the United States. There were 20 lynchings in 1933, and he equated that with the 20 people who died in 1692 during the Salem witch trials. And he tried to point to his congregation the fact that we haven't really improved. We think of ourselves as civilized people. We think of ourselves as continually improving, and therefore civilized. But what he was saying in 1933 is, I believe, still important today when it comes to the issue of terrorism and the United States war on terror. And so what I would like everybody to be thinking about tonight is, are we civilized? So first I wanted to start off with just one. I was looking for some quotes and interesting anecdotes to throw into the sermon. So I found a quote by Nelson Mandela in 2000, obviously before 9/11, where he said, I was called a terrorist yesterday, but when I came out of jail, many people embraced me, including my enemies. And that is what I normally tell other people who say that those who are struggling for liberation in their country are terrorists. I tell them that I was also a terrorist yesterday, but today I am admired by the very people who said I was one. And this is not to justify the acts of terrorists. This quote is obviously taken out of context and was said before 9/11. But what it is a quote that I think is interesting because it exemplifies how the word has changed after 9/11. He could say this in 2000, but he couldn't say this in 2002, 2003, or even today. So one of the points that I want to make about this topic of the war on terror and also terrorism in general is the way that this debate changed, and certain ways that also how quotes can be thrown around by certain people who want to pursue a certain agenda, in the same way that scriptures can be applied to being unshaven. So, as I said, Saperstein was trying to create a historical progression from 1692 to 1933, and today I would like to point out just some simple results of the war on terror. So, on 9/11, 2,977 people were killed in the United States at the Twin Towers and also at the Pentagon. That's an aggregate number of the number of people that died because of the acts of terror. And the response of the United States in Afghanistan has resulted in an estimated 6,000 to 9,000 civilian casualties directly as a result of American actions. And in Iraq, which is also considered to be a part of the war on terror, between 100,000 and 115,000 casualties in Iraq. So the question that I again want us to think about is, are we civilized? If you look at passages in Exodus where the Bible and also other religious denominations, like the Jewish religion as well as the Muslim religion, talk a lot about different reactions. In the Old Testament, justice is eye for an eye. If you kill someone, you should get killed. If you steal from somebody, you should have an equal punishment in return, right? But I would argue that this question of are we civilized is moving beyond any of these types of concepts of justice. We are now recognizing that things like turning the other cheek, things like not reacting to violence with violence as a civilized behavior. We can react to violence with the law. We have a legal system, we have international institutions and other things that are nonviolent. And continuing with this theme of misappropriating quotations to people and also misapplying things, because I think that that's one thing that's important to remember, is that quotes can be taken out of context. Nixon actually was one person who has some very good quotes in support of nonviolent actions. When you have the choice between violent action and nonviolent action, to choose nonviolent action. And a lot of these quotes were during his campaign arguing against the Vietnam War, which he in turn escalated into Cambodia and Laos. So again, the way that quotations that can be pulled out of religious texts and also from political speakers are, I would say, dubious and very hard to pin down. So one of the things about the war on terror that makes it a hard topic to discuss in religious circles, I believe, and also the reason that we don't talk about it very often in church, is because we do have a relative amount of political unity behind this topic. So, for example, George Bush in 2005 says, "We do not create terrorism by fighting terrorists, we invite terrorism by ignoring them." So he's arguing that nonviolence in this situation would just exacerbate the problem. And Barack Obama follows it up in 2006 by saying that we must always reserve the right to strike unilaterally at terrorists wherever they may exist. But we should know that our success in doing so is enhanced by engaging our allies so that we receive crucial diplomatic, military intelligence and financial support that can lighten our load and add legitimacy to our actions. This means talking to our friends, and at times even our enemies. So Obama is slightly more nuanced in his support of the war on terror, but he is trying to make an argument towards the use of rights, as if this is a situation where we're applying our rights to strike unilaterally, rather than trying to point us towards laws or international modes of behavior. And I think that this nuanced view is something that is flawed. I think it is something that we as Americans have started to grow very attached to. We have been doing it since the Philippines in 1898. And we even started before that. But I think 1898 is a good place to start, because it was at that point that we actually started joining colonial powers and our actions in the Philippines resulted in the deaths of an estimated 3 million people. So this was also a point where people like Grover Cleveland, Andrew Carnegie, Mark Twain started what was called the Anti-Imperialist League in America. And they were trying to fight against this trend that they started to see. And one of the things that they're trying to argue is an adherence to the law and an application of the American Constitution in international law, and recognizing the same things that founded our own countries in the West, in Europe, and in the United States. Concepts like the governed have a right to govern themselves. So not the United States going into the Philippines and governing them, but giving them the ability to make decisions for themselves, and not using violence in order to achieve our goals internationally. And I find it interesting simply to see how common it was and is for America to resort to violence in an international sphere. So one of the things I was doing the other day, as I was preparing to speak to you today, was I was thinking about war and its relationship to civilization. So the way that I see war is it probably started sometime way back when there's a group of people who can't communicate with another group of people. Something has happened between them that causes them not to trust each other. They're either fighting over resources or they have different types of interests. But because of the lack of language and other things, they make the decision that they need to preemptively attack that other group. And so, in a very barbaric way, they go over into the other village and they just kill everybody as a precaution. And I feel like that was how the beginning of war probably began, as a result of the inability to communicate as well as ignorance on the part of the first group and fear of the second group. So what I would like to argue is that this question that Saperstein was posing to us in 1933 is something that we should be continually posing to ourselves as we are considering war. And there is a congressional report that comes out every year that talks about American military involvement. And if you Wikipedia it, which I did, it turns into a massive document where I'm only listing years and countries since the Philippines where the United States has deployed its troops. And instead of listing every country every year, I would simply like to say that there are 150 countries on this list, and there is not a single year in which the United States did not deploy its military into a foreign country. So this is not something that we do every once in a while, or a thing that we do as a result of the inability to find nonviolent means. This is actually a very fundamental way in which we interact with other countries. And I would argue that it's barbaric. It is uncivilized. And so one of the ways, the way in which Saperstein finishes up his sermon, again referring to the lynchings and the connection between the Salem witch trials in 1692, he finishes up the sermon by saying this right here. He says to the congregation, "Think one moment, my friends, who is it that suffers whenever the mob takes the power and the law into its own hands? Yes, it is the Jew who suffers. For the mob is moved by passion and not by reason. And always the first victim of the mob has been the Jew. The mob that participated in the program in Kishinev in 1903 thought that they were fighting for the right and for God. The Nazi mobs who attacked and tortured Jews in the early months of the Hitler regime thought that they were fighting in the cause of right. Once the right of the mob to take the administration of justice into itself becomes established, there is danger in store for the Jew. My friends, the way to eliminate crime is not by passion and violence. If justice is uncertain and slow, then our duty is to speed it up and make certain its administration, not to overthrow it. The measure of a nation's civilization is determined by the extent to which even-handed justice by the state has been substituted for passion and revenge by individuals. America has raised its voice in protest against the barbarity of the Nazi Germany, the Nazi regime. But, my friends, America has its own house to clean. In view of the events of the past weeks, the United States stands condemned before the world. We will reap the fruits of these events in sorrow and in pain. My God, grant that never again our civilization be negated and the name of our country besmirched by such acts of horror and shame. So, these are the words of Saperstein in 1933. I believe that they are applicable today. And I invite you guys to seriously consider this trend that we have developed as a country.